here is Ticky on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Well, coming up, stripped of its licence and in administration and facing a civil penalty action from the regulator, Dover Financial's boss hits back at the Royal Commission and ASIC. Our exclusive interview with Terry McMaster, who alleges that Kenneth Haynes' interim report contains deliberate misstatements, accusing ASIC of deliberate misuse of power to shut down Dover, and claims mental health issues from the interrogation where he collapsed at the Royal Commission. Coming off a high, Canadian pot stock Camity Growth shares have had a major correction in the last couple of weeks, back up to 20% after a tear of a year. So what should we make of the world's largest medical cannabis company? Our interview with Chairman, CEO and co-founder Bruce Linton. And October is Cybercrime Month, and software security giant McAfee Chief Technology Officer Steve Grobman is in town. We talk strategy for business, why a whole of government approach is vital, and what to do about the latest wave of crypto jacking. Let's just talk about Brazil, because we don't do that very much, do we? Well, today, the 8th largest economy in the world has got a new president. One means a dramatic swing from the left to the hard right for such an important emerging market. Now, the new guy has been called the Trump of the tropics, Mr. Bolsonaro. Outspoken on race, migration, abortion and homosexuality. Oh, and he's said to be a misogynist. A former army officer, Bolsonaro is not from one of the major parties, and perhaps that's why he's popular. Brazil itself has been through a roller coaster of political corruption in recent years, which has left its visionary leader, Lula da Silva, from 2003, now in jail. Lula and his legacy has kept the Workers' Party in office for all these years since. He handpicked his successor, Dilma Rousseff, in 2010. Excuse me. And while his policies are said to have pulled almost 30 million Brazilians out of poverty, it is the entrenched corruption that people hate now. Well, Dilma Rousseff herself was impeached in 2016 for financial wrongdoing, but this was all part of a much bigger scandal, the biggest in Latin American history, actually, Operation Car Wash, where many businessmen and politicians were linked to dodgy dealing involving Petrobras, the state-owned oil giant. The election today, well, looks like a really big victory for Bolsonaro against the Workers' Party candidate. In fact, if you recall, Bolsonaro is lucky to be alive after he lost 40% of his blood a couple of weeks ago in a stabbing attack. Who knows how that played into the election? South America has always been hard for Australia to get its head around, I think. A bit of coverage during the Olympic Games and FIFA World Cup in Brazil, but otherwise it's really a competitor, Vale, with its iron ore to China, or great beef businesses. But Bolsonaro's victory here is an important one on a world scale, and important for us because of what he's promising to do. For a start, he's threatening to pull out of the Paris Agreement, the home of the Amazon, the lungs of the world. What does it mean for development? Just how he will cleanse Brazil of corruption is unclear, but he's pro-guns. He's likely to turn off the money with less intervention in government programmes generally. It's a very big moment for Brazil. Well, let's go first to Terry McMaster, CEO of Dover Financial, and in a moment we'll run our interview with him in perhaps the most extraordinary moments in the Royal Commission. Terry McMaster appeared at the Haynes Royal Commission and actually collapsed in court. We all remember those pictures. The grilling Terry McMaster received revealed that ASIC had major issues with its so-called client protection insurance policy. Well, since then, Dover has lost its licence to operate. Mr. McMaster is outraged at his treatment and has penned an explosive official response to Ken Haynes' Royal Commission report. That report, his response, was obtained by my colleague Aleks Vickovich, editor of yourmoney.com.au, and Alex joins me now.
Evening, Ticky.
Evening. Now, Alex, well done. This is really interesting stuff. I'm just looking at his response. It was very explosive, as I say.
Yeah, look, I think this is one of the more interesting subplots of the Royal Commission so far, not just because of that famous image of Terry McMaster being taken out in a stretcher that you alluded to, but also because, you know, Dover has been one of the largest casualties so far of the Royal Commission, and in this response to the interim report, Terry McMaster does not hold back. He, you know, accuses ASIC and the Royal Commission of sort of colluding together to bring down Dover, and he uses some very strong language in the process. So we've got a story on yourmoney.com.au at the moment outlining a little more from that.
OK. Let's go back a bit. What was he actually, what's ASIC accusing him of? Or what was the grilling around?
Yeah, two things primarily. First is that client protection policy that you mentioned that ASIC and the Royal Commission seem to believe is anything but. In fact, Mark Costello, QC, you know, counsel assisting, described the policy as Orwellian. And the charge is that this policy, which was basically the terms and conditions between Dover's financial advisors and their clients, the point of it was to shift liability for, say, investment losses off the advisor and the licensee and put them onto the consumer. So it doesn't sound like there was a whole lot of...
And the more vulnerable ones, it would appear, the more difficult ones.
That was one of the charges, yes. And so ASIC's brought a civil claim now against Terry McMaster. But, you know, in speaking to him, he is defending that policy and, you know, doesn't believe that they've done anything wrong. OK, well, let's show you that exclusive interview with Dover Financial CEO Terry McMaster and yourmoney.com.au digital editor Aleks Vickovich. Well, Terry McMaster, thank you for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure.
I want to talk about your response to the Royal Commission's interim report and some of the substantive matters that both ASIC and the Royal Commission raise in relation to Dover Financial Advisors, your company. But firstly, I want to take you back to that afternoon in Melbourne. And you were undergoing some intense questioning.
Yes.
For those of us who were watching, you became visibly uncomfortable. You know, the colour started to drain from your face and subsequently you collapsed and Kenneth Hayne called in the paramedics. What happened to you?
I fainted. But that's the short story. The longer story, the backstory is a week or so of sleep deprivation, knowing that something was wrong, that the stories coming out of the Royal Commission didn't make sense, particularly the cases of Andrew Smith and Adam Palmer, who were Dover advisors, who were painted as rogues by the Royal Commission, when in fact Dover's experience in the previous 4 years or so they'd each been with Dover, that they were close to the perfect advisors, technically competent, not one complaint, not one foot put wrong in the whole time, and observing a high quality of advice going through when we checked their work. And also intrigued because the nature of complaints is that if there was a complaint from Smith's Westpac days or Palmer's AMP days, in that preceding 4 years, we would have been exposed to it. But there was no such exposure. We did not have the slightest hint that there had been something wrong. And to be frank, I doubt there was anything wrong.
So you talk about the case of these two financial advisors, and you say in your very strongly worded response to Kenneth Hayne's interim report that the evidence, ASIC evidence relating to these two financial advisors was suppressed by the Royal Commission. You also say that you were ambushed. What do you mean by that?
Well, on the day I was ambushed, I was provided with what's called a rubric, a quaint phrase, really just meaning an agenda or a list of things you're going to be asked about. And the rubric was limited to Dover's new advisor recruitment policies and a bit on our statement of advice review and general compliance. I rang the Royal Commission and confirmed that that was the agenda. That's what I would be questioned on. And I relied on that. I prepared for that and didn't prepare for other matters. But on the day, 2/3 of the questions were off the rubric, not on the agenda. Not only were they off the rubric, if you like, ambushes, no notice of the question, but they were spun, they were pitched, not in a way to elicit truth, but to damage, to insult almost.
Surely it's legitimate for the Royal Commission to ask anything that it deems to be in the public interest. I mean, the terms of reference set out in terms of getting to the bottom of misconduct were quite clear.
Well, I'm sure damage and insult was what the public was interested in, but a Royal Commission should be interested in something else. It should be interested in genuinely understanding a process, not in tarring a person who really can't respond. And if that person tries to respond, tries to explain, is either cut off or, in some cases, literally told, no, you can't explain.
So as a solicitor...
That's not a help.
And as a solicitor, your assessment is that the Royal Commission has lacked procedural fairness on that?
Well, I'll give you an example. I think examples speak louder than my opinion. Adam Palmer, very good advisor. He left the AMP. He wasn't terminated by the AMP. He left voluntarily. He was sometime later accused of misdemeanours by the AMP, and the AMP was brought as the only witness in respect of Adam Palmer. There were a series of leading questions from the leading questioner, and each one of them was, I would say, misleading, culminating in statements that Adam Palmer was engaged in illegal activity and was dishonest. Both completely false statements, to be frank. Procedural fairness, where was Adam that day? When did he get his chance to respond? The ASIC barristers were there. Why didn't they speak up and say something? Mr Hayne, you've got it wrong, when it got to the examination-in-chief phase at the close of the cross-examination. No one spoke a word.
So this is one of the issues that you've said have been deliberate misstatements from the Royal Commission. The other core issue that the Commission has taken issue with when it comes to Dover, as has ASIC, is your client protection policy. And the charge against Dover is that this policy, these terms and conditions that set out how your advisors interact with their clients, that they were stacked in favour of the licensee, that they were all about shifting liability off the licensee and the financial advisor and putting them back on the client. And indeed, you know, Mark Casello QC described that policy as Orwellian. What was the purpose of the client protection policy? How was it meant to work?
Well, I began to explain that to the Royal Commission, or at least try to explain, and I was cut off, called Orwellian, and the statement was made, not that I was a liar, but that I was speaking untruths. So I was effectively called an Orwellian liar, which became a great headline. Mission accomplished. If I was given the opportunity to explain, to continue, I would have said it's very complex, but in summary, the key feature of the client protection policy was a notice allowed under the law, Section 917D, which doesn't reduce liability, rather it moves liability back to the advisor. Then I would have continued and said that we were telling the advisors at CPD days and induction days and elsewhere that if they don't put the statement of advice in for review, and something goes wrong, we will rely on that notice. So they'll be liable for the negligent act or omission, not Dover. It was a stick to make the advisors put the statements of advice in, which worked very effectively with other tools, with other carrots and with other sticks as well. And that protected clients because it made sure that the advices were always reviewed by our in-house legal people plus an external legal firm, but it also brought into play external legal advice, legal insurance, professional indemnity insurance, which is much better, much better than AFSL insurance in that there's no threshold or deductible amount and there's what's called run-off cover. So even today, the Dover clients are covered by the legal professional indemnity insurance, and that will continue indefinitely.
Nonetheless, Terry, clearly this client protection policy was one of the chief factors that has now resulted in Dover's licence being cancelled. Do you regret that part of your business?
Obviously. It wasn't critical. When it was brought to our attention a month or so before the Royal Commission, 2 years or so after ASIC became aware of it, and after ASIC had reviewed literally hundreds of statements of advice with it in it, without mentioning any concerns, when it was brought to our attention, we actually fixed it within 1 day. We didn't argue. We said, sure, we want to be compliant. If you guys think it's not compliant, we'll change it. And we did. No client was prejudiced. To this day, no clients complained about it. The idea that an AFSL would be shut down in those circumstances is unprecedented. Much worse things have happened recently and in bygone years without anything like ASIC's response here.
So you believe there's a double standard there in the way that Dover was treated compared to other financial services providers?
Absolutely, no question about it.
And just finally, you do talk about in your response to the interim report, you personally having suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, mental ill health as a result of this cross-examination. Do you blame the Royal Commission squarely for that?
A little bit. The Royal Commission was livable, unpleasant, embarrassing, stressful, anxiety-inducing, but it would have passed. The real, I think, evil came later with ASIC shutting Dover down without giving us any choice or option but to shut down and telling us that in writing. And then when we did, as we were ordered to do, on the day we were ordered to do it, ASIC almost immediately came out denying any involvement. That was extremely stressful. It generated very negative press, which is something I've never had to experience before. I mean, I've never been in the press before. That's not what I do. Great stress for my family. And, you know, there's suddenly talk of advisors having class actions and all this sort of thing, and being unable to, at the time, tell what actually happened, having to remain silent in the face of that media and advisor storm.
Well, there are now civil claims that have been brought by ASIC against you. We'll be following that matter very closely. Terry McMaster, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that was Dover Financial CEO Terry McMaster there, speaking with Your Money digital editor Aleks Vickovich. Now, Alex is still joining me at the desk, and also welcome back to our chief reporter Leo Shanahan, who's been away for a few weeks in the Middle East. We'll hear more about that a little bit later. But first of all, Leo, you followed the Royal Commission very carefully. What do you make of the response from Terry McMaster?
Yeah, well, I think you have to separate what is obvious pain and embarrassment of a man who's lost his livelihood from some of the hyperbole and actual statements of fact that have gone on. Nonetheless, I think he does make some reasonable points around consistency of ASIC's approach. But if we take it back to what he was being investigated, well, his company was being investigated by ASIC prior to the Royal Commission. There was intervention and an ASIC requirement that he comply with this intervention prior to the Royal Commission.
Yes.
So to turn up at the Royal Commission and say, oh, well, I wasn't expecting questions about an ASIC investigation into my business.
Well, I thought, Alex,
is a bit...
I thought, Alex, you made the very good point that, well, look, it is a Royal Commission. They can really ask whatever they like, even though they've sort of said, look, prepare for this. And they, by the way, Dover Financial aren't the only companies who are complaining about this, that, you know, the Royal Commission has said, prepare for this, and then they get them on a whole range of other things. But on the other hand, should you not be across the whole corporate brief?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think, you know, a cancellation is at the pointier end of what ASIC calls its regulatory toolkit.
Yes.
So this was a fairly significant, you know, incident, not just for Terry McMaster, but also for 400 authorised representatives,
yes.
Only a number of whom may have had misconduct issues and were given, you know, 30 days to find a new licence. Thousands of Australians who are seeing advice from one of these Dover advisors, and had there been a, you know, significant market event, may not have been able to
and
receive
as he said,
advice.
no one actually complained, or he received almost no complaints, and no one has lost out.
Well, that's what Terry McMaster says.
That's what he says, yeah.
Yeah, but we'll say, I mean, there is this civil claim ongoing between ASIC and Terry McMaster, and no doubt more information will come out throughout that. I think Leo makes a good point. You do need to separate these two issues. At the same time, clearly he's a broken man to some extent. He's felt the full personal impact of this, and I think it's legitimate to show, you know, given the advancement of the mental health discussion in the business world, the kind of personal toll and personal ramifications of misconduct.
Yeah. Leo, okay, so even if no one actually was worse off, the bottom line is, if these are misleading statements, you're not allowed to do it.
Yeah, and firstly, we don't know that anyone wasn't worse off, and the point of the financial services industry is, particularly relating to financial planning, is it was very murky in both the terms of complaint process, complaint handling, and even knowing things had gone on. For example, AMP's no fee for service program. So I think that claiming necessarily that no one was worse off might look a bit cute. But yes, and ultimately ASIC did find wrongdoing. I can't help but think they were under a lot of pressure in terms of the Royal Commission and the way in which they've been criticised. And I think to that end he might have a good point. I mean, the major banks have been found guilty of much worse conduct in both terms of the Royal Commission, but prior to that, and including AMP as well, they haven't lost their financial services licence, and for this type of behaviour you can lose your financial services licence, and for a bank that would extend to their banking.
Too big to fail, sort of.
No, exactly right, but they are selling off these businesses for a reason. I think there's a broader point here about the Royal Commission, that you might see a lot of these defences starting to emerge from those who feel they've been hard done by the Royal Commission. We've seen this in other similar types of hearings or structures, like ICAC, for instance.
And Leo, I mean, just looking at the Royal Commission, there was a lot of theatrics. You did get the strong impression that they'd gone across all these documents that they'd received from everybody, and just on the face of those documents, they'd decided, look, we're going to go for this, this and this, because this is the really bad stuff, and then we're sort of going to play it our way.
Yeah,
almost.
And that is the attraction of a Royal Commission for judges and lawyers who aren't constrained by due process. So to turn around and say, well, the court due process isn't there, is merely a statement of fact. It's not there. Much like the ICACs, the media are invited to attend. It's filmed. So yes, it is structured as a media event. For better or for ill, it's actually produced a lot of very worthwhile, I think, content.
Well, certainly worth doing.
Use a media term.
Now, Aleks, did you get a feeling for where to now for Terry McMaster?
Well, not really. I mean, you know, the licence has been cancelled. He does still have a number of elements of his business that he runs that are not in any way related to financial services, and you know, ASIC is seeking to remove him from financial services completely. I imagine he's been spending quite a bit of time producing this lengthy document, which we've got the highlights of. But look, I'm not sure what's next for Terry. I think the broader issue as well here is there's a competition implication from this story as well. I think it's interesting that, you know, in the interim report, Kenneth Hayne mentions that a concentration of power in the financial planning industry among the banks and AMP has been potentially a cause of misconduct. Dover is one of the few large independently owned groups who was providing that competition, and ironically, you know, their removal from the market may have seen a less competitive industry.
Well, that's very interesting. We'll see. We'll keep following Dover. Aleks Vickovich, well done on that report. Thank you very much. And Leo, great to have you back. Leo Shanahan, thanks for your comments. Right, well, after the break, volatility in cannabis stocks after recreational use was legalised in Canada. We'll discuss with one of the Goliaths in the industry, Bruce Linton, CEO of Canada's Canopy Growth.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Yeah, welcome back. Well, last week, recreational cannabis use was legalised in Canada. Pot stocks spiked Customer queues apparently ran out the door. Sales did so well, they're now talking about a potential supply crisis. One company you'd think would benefit hugely is Canopy Growth, an $11 billion business and Canada's largest medicinal marijuana supplier. But shares actually have been in the doldrums this past month. They're down 20%. That's a fall of 17% in last week alone, despite the good news for dope smokers everywhere. So what's going on? Well, joining me live in the studio all the way from Canada is Canopy Growth co-CEO, co-founder Bruce Linton. Bruce, great to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, well, tell me first about your share price, because everyone's focused on that. I guess you're listed. Yeah. You're listed where at the moment?
So we're on New York Stock Exchange is the primary transaction, and Toronto Stock Exchange secondarily.
Yeah. Why do you reckon the stock fell back? Because it's been on a tear before, all the way through the year.
It sort of ebbs and flows, right? So there's a big run up to medical, but you know, when things traded off, it was a pretty bad week last week for everybody.
Correct.
And what we found is, you know, if you bought my stock 3 months ago, you're still up 2x.
Yeah, yeah.
And
but do you think there's a bit of profit taking?
Yes, there's profit taking, as people should, and then they're going to take. I think what you're going to see is they're going to look at it, and it's not going to just be retail people.
Yeah.
So I've been running around marketing the company for years, including in Sydney.
Yes.
And today, instead of having 4 meetings, I have, I think, 34 guests who've either had me in or are seeing me for dinner.
Yeah.
And so it's more institutional.
So let's talk Canopy growth.
Yeah.
So where do you see your growth now? Obviously, you've got your plantations are mostly in Canada, is that right?
So we're in 11 countries, 12 countries.
Yeah.
We just had another one. So in Canada, we have about 4 million square feet. I'm bad at doing meters, even though I should be good at it in Canada, and that's up and running. Another 2 million to come on. But we have operations with plants in places like Denmark, Spain. We have put product down to you know, Australia, but also to, say, Brazil.
Yeah.
And so what we do is, where it's federally legal, we go. It's not federally legal yet in America. Yet 2 weeks ago, the American government, through the DEA, needed cannabis, and over a 2-year period, we got approval and sent them the first cannabis from Canada.
So when you say it's not legal in the US, not legal for medicinal cannabis?
Federally. So for any purpose. So, you know, America's kind of got this scheme right now that's pretty awkward.
Yes.
States are saying it's in favor and yes, you can do it, but the feds are saying it's the same as any other Schedule I drug, so we're going to treat it like cocaine or something, so you can't bank your business.
So were that to change, presumably that would be on your doorstep in Canada, a massive, game changer.
Yeah, for sure. And about August this year, we have a partner that in the US, they distribute things like Corona and Behringer and, you know, Mondavi, things that big company called Constellation. This Wednesday, they're due to put about $5 billion into our bank account to increase their position, in part so we can go more aggressively into the US if and when it opens.
Do you have investors that just want to steer clear of you guys still?
Well, I would say
or
that
is
was
everybody open to a bit of
if I was here 4 years ago, I'd be begging you to take my stock for 38 cents.
Yes.
And so what's happened is this has opened up globally, and now I have meetings with the biggest funds in the world who are looking at this saying it's probably the most disruptive thing that's going to happen in maybe the next 50 years.
Yeah. It's
disruptive to alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceutical, sports recovery. So you start saying, how much is that add up to? And this guy named Kramer, who does a show called Mad Money, he thinks maybe it adds up to about 500 billion, and I think he talks US dollars.
Right.
So it's a pretty substantial
And you're
disruptor.
in Australia?
Yeah, we have a facility that we've just acquired here.
Yeah.
We have
Down
a team.
in Victoria?
Yeah, and we have a team of about 8 or 10 people that we're now ramping that up, starting to do the research, starting to do the doctor outreach, and this is going to be a long game in Australia. You should be thinking sort of 3 to 5 years, and it'll start to see its, how big it could be.
So the question I have for you is that it would appear that for medicinal cannabis has been such a sort of life, well, you know, certainly in terms of quality of life saver for so many people. I mean, I think most people now have got there. Recreational cannabis is a bit of a polemic in that, I mean, anecdotally, I could say I've known friends who've smoked for 20 years and they're not the same people that they would have been if they hadn't. They're just not. They lose motivation. I mean, we all anecdotally, we all know this in our gut. So at what point is somebody going to say, hang on a minute, where's the social license for these people who are putting out this, you know?
Well, I think, that 20-year person would have been better served by actually regulation and education.
Right.
And so who knows?
So like alcohol.
Well, who knows what they were smoking, and did they actually get what they thought they were getting?
Yeah.
Why are they smoking? If you regulate and educate, why don't you change the format into a beverage so there's no inhalation?
Yeah.
Why don't you start making it so that kids understand what this is about and where it is. And so I think what's happened in Canada in the last 10 days are more conversations around the kitchen table that should have been happening a long time ago. Maybe your friend's parents should have talked about it 20 years ago. Because, you know, this is one of these things where we have a lot of conversations about don't smoke tobacco with our kids. I have young, boys. And we have a lot of conversations about why not alcohol and when. And so why that conversation isn't properly informed is because if you don't regulate, you don't educate. Yeah.
And do you think it'll get to a stage where people are tested for levels of marijuana if they go into the workplace to make sure that they don't?
They should be. It's any country that has a medical program should be having a program at work where if you're on opioids, you're far more dangerous than if you had alcohol or cannabis. So you should have a workplace policy. Any governance should say.
And that is a big problem in the US, isn't it?
It's a big problem around the world. It's gigantic in the US, but down the rank you go US, Canada, Germany. But when people are on painkillers or medicine like cannabis, they may wish to then say, I need a modified work schedule.
So you talked a little bit about the innovation. I mean, everybody says, thinks about but actually there's a lot more to it than that. What are the other products that are on offer?
So what happens is, in order to make cannabis into something, you're really not using the plant, you're using the oil in the plant. And once you extract that, it's not one kind of thing. There are hundreds of types of cannabis, and inside each there might be 80 or 90 ingredients. And so once you start taking them out, you can re-put them together and say, well, this could be a beverage that makes you feel lighthearted, has no calories. Or it could become something that in geriatric care, when you think about elderly people, what are they? They usually get moved to a home which is not theirs. So they become anxious, they don't sleep well, they don't like the food because it's not theirs, and they're old, so they have aches and pains. Well, I think cannabis could be a way that's a gel cap. It could be for sleeping. So we're running clinical trials. They've got the approval in Canada to say, how can we make people sleep better?
And it's such a challenge, as we all know now, the nursing home challenge for older people. It really is.
And the way we treat elderly people, we wonder why they start to act a little demented a bit. But if you have that many different types of drugs in you, and they're not coming out of you quickly because you're old, not mobile, I think it's going to be looked at in 5 years as why didn't we start this sooner?
So you talked about your markets around the world. What are the most exciting ones for you? The ones that are going to tip the soonest, do you think?
Germany. Right? If you think Germany, Germans, they're reckless and crazy and they don't like order, or they have the best organized cannabis system for medical. And so last quarter it was 10% of my sales, and they are a pretty high consumer per capita of opioids. And so what they're looking at is how do we get people cannabis as a first-line option, not a last-line option. And so we had about 1,000 pharmacies now in Germany that have our product, and we're working to have oils and other things that Germany, I think, is pretty well situated to be the medical leader and order leader in Europe. So that's a big deal.
Bruce, it's fascinating to hear you, and look, I wish you all the best of it. It's terrific. Thanks.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Okay, after the break, where are the business opportunities in India? Talking the Indian economy with the chairman on India's business standard, TN9.
This is TICKY on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Welcome back. India, incredible, yes, but just where are Australia-India relations going, and what are the business opportunities? The free trade agreement seems to have been put into the too hard basket for the moment, but that big report for the Australian government, the India Economic Strategy to 2035, which we talked about with author Peter Varghese earlier in the year. Now, it suggests Indian investment in Australia could be $100 billion by 2035. So India's reforms under the Prime Minister have been substantial, but on the ground, what's it like doing business with India? Well, joining me for his views, a long-time leader in business journalism in India, TN9. He's chairman of Business Standard Limited. TN9 has also been the editor of Business Standard. He's also published it there, actually. Editor of the Economic Times and Business World, plus the executive editor at India Today. He's also a member of the Board of Trade and now holds a plethora of non-executive positions. TN9 joins me at the desk. Nine, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Dick.
Now, tell me first about our free trade agreement, because in Australia, we were quite optimistic about doing it, but just didn't seem to sync right. Why is that?
Well, the current government that came in 4 years ago reviewed all existing free trade agreements and came to the view that they had not worked as well for Indian business as they had hoped when they were signed.
Why is that? What did Indian business want?
Well, they should have used the free trade agreements to push for change domestically that would have given business the opportunity to take advantage of freer markets elsewhere. And you could say that that did not happen. So other countries took advantage and you did not. For instance, your whole garments business, neighboring Bangladesh did much better, has done much better.
Right.
They were smaller, now they're bigger.
There was a sense that maybe there was a lot of sort of tariffs and changing of rules all the time in India, and you've got to be a bit careful if you're trying to do anything with India.
Yes, and this government, I think, has been a little more defensive about tariffs. Earlier, they were only going down. Now some of them have started going back up.
Yes.
So to some degree, it reflects uncertainty about export growth, which has not done that well in recent years.
And our exports, of course, we love our agriculture here. Our exports into agriculture will be particularly sensitive for India, presumably.
Yes, but Australian exports to India have done very well. There is, I think, something like a 3-to-1 imbalance between Australia's exports to India and imports from India. But of course, you have the stuff that we need. You have, you have coal, and our power demand is growing.
Yes.
You have agricultural goods that we buy. So there is a need for Australian products, and we need to find the things that we can supply to Australia in greater numbers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, services. We think of India and contracting out a lot of our services. Is that still growing? Is that still substantial?
Yes, I think some of our tech companies want to come in here. They have come in here,
yes,
and they would like to do more.
Yeah.
That's one of the points of negotiation that India would like. More short-term access for technical people to come and work here and then go back.
And what about reforms in India, Nandan? Because again, the stories from here seem to be, well, we don't quite know what it's like on the ground. It's rather different to China, but still unfathomable.
Well, I'm not sure that's true.
Maybe that's a bit of a strong word, but tricky.
I mean, India is not the easiest of places to do business, and people from countries like Australia can find it a little daunting, but it's not that hard either. Lots of companies from around the world, and one example I gave the other day was the 1,700 German companies in India doing perfectly good business. We get $40 billion of foreign investment every year, and they all do well, and the economy is growing.
So what's their business?
A whole range of everything.
Right.
Australia doesn't have a manufacturing base of the kind that Germany does. So all the German manufacturing companies have moved into India in the same way they moved into China.
I see, yeah. And you've got, I mean, the reforms that I was suggesting that Mr. Modi has put through, I mean, you've now got bankruptcy laws, for example.
Yes, we have a new effective bankruptcy law. But, the point on the foreign investment is that you can now get 100% foreign ownership in almost all sectors, except for a few sensitive ones, atomic energy or defense, banking and so on.
Would you have 100% foreign ownership though, or is a joint venture a better idea?
No, joint ventures were yesterday's story.
Oh,
now
really?
companies come in on their own. Yeah, you don't need a joint local partner. You can come in with your own company and you can start business.
But what about having intelligence on the ground? Isn't it? That's what we were always told. That joint ventures.
You can always hire a professional.
Knowledge.
You can hire a consultant. You can. It's not that difficult. I think Australian companies or businessmen are a little diffident about trying to get in.
Yeah.
It's a big market. I mean, the whole Peter Verghese report story, that this is a market that's going to explode.
Yeah.
And it's already 2.6 trillion. It's going to double in less than a decade.
Yeah.
So think of it as a sort of Japan, $5 trillion economy in less than 10 years. I think China is further ahead, and so further down the road. But we are now growing faster than China.
Yes.
China was way faster to report.
Our relationship with China as well is very different from your relationship with China, isn't it? I mean, you've got there's a trade balance issue there as for a start.
There's a trade balance issue. There are strategic issues. There's a disputed border question, and the two countries are essentially competitive and perhaps even adversarial.
Yeah.
And in the China-US
big.
Yeah, of course. And in the China-US binary, if you will, we're now on the US side more than on the Chinese side. And so Australia and India now find ourselves on the same side, so to speak. So you have this Japan, Australia, India, US quadrilateral and so on of democracies.
Well, equally, we're in a bit of a posse, though, aren't we? Because our largest exporter in Australia is we export to China. That's our big market. So.
The whole point of that is that you need a counterbalance. You don't want to be too dependent on one country and one market. And if you look around, who's your counterbalance? India is a sort of natural candidate.
Exactly. So just drilling down a little bit more, going the other way, Indian investment in Australia. Now, Peter Varghese was saying it could be 100 billion by 2034. Now, what sort of things would India be interested in?
Well, you have one big investment that features in Australian news quite often.
Yes. Yes. Well, you mean Adani.
But we have,
yes.
but the point is
that... Do you reckon that's going to happen?
Oh, that's up to you. I mean, it's up to your government.
Yeah. But, I mean, what's the feeling in India? Will it actually go through, or is there just this rump of, anger about coal? It just is not going to get there.
He's a what? He's a sharp, ambitious, very successful, rapidly growing businessman. So if it can get done, he'll get it done. But Indian companies across the board have been moving out much more than in the past. So outbound investment, which is non-existent, actually took off some time ago. And Indian companies are looking at other markets.
Well, interestingly, we've had his Indian family, but he's not based here. He's based in Britain. Sanjeev Gupta, of course, has done a lot of investing down here, and he's got his trade relations with India.
Yes.
But in terms of...
This is the Liberty Group.
That's right, Liberty Group.
He's just bought a company in India as well.
He has, yeah. No, he's joining all the dots, or it would seem. We're interviewing him actually later in the week. But in terms of pure Indian interest in India, would that be in arable land, or would that be in manufacturing businesses here, do you think? Suppliers?
I think our main strength is services, actually.
Right, yeah.
60% of the Indian economy is services.
Yeah.
We do have a manufacturing base, which is a quarter of the economy.
Yeah. Well, we've got
but it's not as big as China is.
We've got our banks spinning off businesses left, right and centre with the Indians
and we have, we've created a lot of new technology platforms that really can create the base for a lot of other businesses. So I think services is, and now people, I mean, we have lots of people, and you're taking some of them, and you have quite a few of them now in Australian universities as students. And, if you look at the India-US relationship, the Indian diaspora in the US is a strong bond which works for the advantage of the bilateral relationship, and I'm sure it can happen here as well.
Nine, and so fascinating. I wish I had longer to talk to you, but thank you so much for your views.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
See you, Nine, in there. Moving on to international news, and America is reeling from a week of violence, apparently motivated by political and racial hatred. 3 suspects have been arrested over 3 crimes, including the mass shooting of a Pittsburgh synagogue and a series of pipe bombs sent to prominent Democrats.
I think clearly these were acts of hate motivated by anti-Semitism.
Congressman Adam Schiff joining leaders across the nation calling out the hatred that motivated Saturday's shooting massacre at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. Authorities say Robert Bowers spewed anti-Semitic comments as he opened fire, killing 11 people in what the Anti-Defamation League says is the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. The shooting came a day after the arrest of a suspect in this week's series of pipe bomb mailings. Authorities say Cesar Sayoc mailed 14 packages containing pipe bombs to high-profile Democrats and public figures criticized by President Trump. None detonated, but all were real. As the manhunt for Sayoc played out earlier in the week, a white man with a history of violence allegedly shot and killed 2 African Americans in Kentucky after first trying to barge into a black church. The suspect, Gregory Bush, was arrested and ordered held on $5 million bond. He pleaded not guilty. Bowers in police custody facing federal hate crimes charges and set to appear in court Monday. Sayoc also set to appear in court Monday. 3 suspects in custody for crimes apparently motivated by hate in a nation in mourning and trying to come to terms with a week of violence.
After the break, we'll discuss the New South Wales government's cybersecurity strategy with McAfee's Steve Grobman.
Now, back to TICKY.
Welcome back. Well, we're almost at the end of Cybersecurity Month. Earlier, we saw the New South Wales state government implement its first cyber security strategy with $20 million dedicated to protecting your public information. This comes as cyber attacks continue to develop, get more sophisticated, expand, with McAfee identifying an 85% increase in cryptojacking over the last quarter. We're here to talk, first of all, the New South Wales government strategy and why more governments should follow our example. I'm joined by McAfee's Global Chief Technology Officer and Senior Vice President, Steve Grobman. Steve, great to have you at the desk.
Hey, TICKY, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I don't know where we start. It's such a big area, but let's go with the New South Wales government, who've announced this. Why is it important for the government to do something like this?
So what the government's doing very well is they're taking a very practical approach. They're really looking at the different types of cyber threats that could impact government systems and are looking at what are the most critical threats, putting the most resources against protecting the things that would have the largest impact, and really looking at it through a pragmatic lens.
So is this, what the New South Wales government has done quite proactive compared to other governments around the world?
It is. One thing that they're doing that is interesting is they're taking advantage of something called the NIST framework, which was developed by the National Institute of Standards. And what it does is it creates a process that allows really a way to think about all of the different types of risk that an organization might have, but also offer flexibility so that as we have new cyber threats, they're not locked into a very rigid set of compliance standards. So if we look at what other governments are doing, where they're being very prescriptive at saying they have to do very specific things, what New South Wales is doing that I think is a very good approach is by using the NIST framework, they're going to have a lot of flexibility to deal with threats as they emerge.
That's very interesting. Do you see Sydney? I noticed we've got BT from Britain, BT Security with their little hub here, and we've got a few others now. Is Sydney a reasonable centre? May not be London, but in terms of cyber tech?
We definitely see a lot of our customers located in the Sydney area and financial services and various other industries, both within Australian companies and multinationals. So there is a good high-tech cyber security market within Sydney. It's definitely one of the major areas that we're focused on from a customer base. So
let's go into what the threats are at the moment. The WannaCries, that sort of threat, that's gone down in your latest report. It's not quite as much, but other things have gone up. So
WannaCry really took advantage of a unique vulnerability that allowed something that we call a worm, essentially the ability for malware to spread from computer to computer without users from doing anything. So we saw some worms in the 90s that very quickly took over corporate environments, government environments, and we really saw in 2017 when WannaCry hit another variant of that worm-based technology.
What stopped it?
It was really that we don't have, it's very rare that we have the type of vulnerability that allowed something like a WannaCry worm to occur. So in 2018, we've been quite lucky that we haven't had that sort of vulnerability. Organizations have been very good at patching the underlying vulnerability that allowed WannaCry in the first place. And what we've seen is cyber attackers are now shifting to other areas that they are able to be effective.
So like billing fraud.
So what cyber criminals will always do is they'll look at cybercrime just like it's any other market, and they'll invest where the cyber criminals will get the maximum return on their investment. So a few years ago, we saw a big shift into ransomware, essentially getting paid directly by the victim. As cryptocurrencies have gone up in price, there's been a lot of benefit from a cyber criminal's perspective to actually steal the computing cycles.
Well, hang on, wait a minute. We had some woman, Miss Nguyen, in the last couple of weeks. She's only 23. She managed to nick $450,000 worth of Ripple, which is a world's third most popular cryptocurrency, I think. But she did that actually by just getting onto somebody's account somehow and stealing their password.
So one of the things that we always see in cybercrime is things we see in the physical world exist in the digital world. So in that case, it's really just theft. So essentially using something like spear phishing to get into somebody's account.
So what's cryptojacking?
So what cryptojacking is it's taking over somebody's computer for the purpose of mining cryptocurrency. Wow. So think of mining cryptocurrency as actually the process of creating new cryptocurrency by solving difficult math problems. Yes. And because the price of cryptocurrency has gone up in the last few years, that has now become a very valuable cyber criminal enterprise. So we've seen a shift where criminals are now investing in cryptojacking.
Now look, the other thing is your latest research reveals that a shocking 67% of the CIOs, Chief Investment Officers, said that chief executives should be held accountable for cyber risk. However, they are perceived by the C-suite as being the least concerned about cyber risk among all C-suite executives.
So one of the things that we really need from CEOs is to take accountability for the risk of their organization. Yeah. And when we think about what cybersecurity is really all about, it's about managing and mitigating risk. Yep. We'll never be able to have cybersecurity risks go away entirely, but having CEOs ensure that their organization is able to invest in risk management, risk mitigation to a point that they can manage those risks, that's really what's going to be the most critical.
Okay, last question, a tickly one for you. Your founder, John McAfee, there's going to be a movie about him, I think, with Johnny Depp in it. He's a colourful character, isn't he?
He is a colourful character. You know, John McAfee really has not been part of the business in over 2 decades.
I know, but it's the brand.
But it definitely, the brand was based on him, and he is a colourful character.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Johnny Depp will do him justice. Steve Grobman, it's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Ticky.
Well, that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, Caltex CEO Julian Siegel, who is in Sydney's Sutherland Shire for the company's Investor Day. Until then, thanks for your company. See you at 5 p.m. tomorrow night, or again at 8 p.m. tonight for catch-up on Foxtel's Channel 604.